Thank you, Asia Society, thank you, NCPA, and thank you. The audience is really, feels like a room full of friends, but a room full of very, very engaged friends who will have a lot of their own opinions about what we're about to discuss this evening. The introductions have been done, but I can't tell you that over the years, Asia Society has actually brought together us in different combinations. And it's always been the same question, how do we deal with the era of turmoil that we're dealing with today? But I don't think we have ever been at a time in the recent past that we see right now. This is the third decade of the 21st century. And just look at what we as a world, as a community, have come through in just the last few years. And there was the COVID pandemic, and it seems a miracle that all of us came through it and are here and are able to move on with our lives after what we saw. There's been one shock after another in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then what it meant for the markets, what it meant for oil prices, what it meant for food, fuel, and fertilizer security, as we often say. The October 7th terror attack in Israel, and then the bombardment of Gaza that has followed, and the war and its complications and the polarization that we saw after that. And then this list goes on. It's just, as I said, we're halfway through the third decade of the 21st century, and we have this incredible list. There's the Trump shock, and that was Trump 1.0, and what his first term kind of did for the world, because what we saw, or what it looked like we were seeing, was American retrenchment from the world order. And what that meant now for the world order, for multilateral institutions, for the UN and all the rest of that. There's China's aggression, and a kind of worry that, where is it going to be next? India faced it from 2020 to 2024, very tough ties with China, and we're seeing a détente only as of yesterday, actually. So we're not just meeting at an interesting time in the long term, but we're meeting at a very interesting time just today, because we have the conversation between Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi. Mr. Modi is going to go to the US in February. We have the détente with China. All happened in the last sort of 24 hours. And then we have something which I don't want to be facetious about, but people are beginning to see as an AI apocalypse. The apocalypse that artificial intelligence might unleash on the world, on the labor trends and the kind of disruption we're likely to see there, and what it means for the future of work, for the future of trade, what it means for our children, really. Are humans now creating the tools to make themselves redundant? So we're dealing with these existential crises around the world, and we don't know what's going to hit us next, because we're only halfway through this particular decade. So I want to broaden this debate a little bit to start with. We have about half an hour or a little over that for our initial comments. I want to bring in as much as the audience as possible. So please do keep your questions ready. I do want to start by asking the basic question, the question that we actually came here originally trying to discuss when we weren't, maybe distracted by all that's happened in the last week, is that if you were to choose, and I'd like to start with you, Professor Mahbubani, and just go around the room. If you were to look at 2025, are there comparisons to 1925 and to the idea of both economic distress and a kind of worry about an impending World War III? Or am I being very, very over the top on that?
Well, thank you for asking me a very difficult question.
Always.
But let me begin first, by the way, by thanking both Asia Society and NCPA for hosting this event. I should declare to all of you that I've been a fan and friend of the Asia Society for at least 42 years. Since I first arrived in Washington, D.C., I was attending Asia Society events. And I've just had the pleasure in the last few months to launch my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, both in the Hong Kong chapter of Asia Society and the New York chapter. So seeing my book here on sale, I feel like Asia Society is my second home. But to answer your question, it's interesting you mentioned 1925, because if you had been here in Mumbai in 1925, there would have been about, I don't know, 100,000, 200,000 Englishmen effortlessly ruling over 300 million Indians. I mean, as I think about it, the question that always comes to my mind is, what happened to my ancestors? How could 300 million of them be bullied by 200,000, 100,000 Englishmen, you know? It's actually quite a shocking thing.
I'm not giving away anything by saying that your book actually begins with the line, blame it on the damn British.
Yeah, it's actually blame it all on the damn British, yes. So clearly the world has changed. And as you know, in a Financial Times article I published a few months ago, I said that the best way for the British to make restitution to India is to give up their Security Council seat and their veto to India. Because the founders of the UN Charter, I'm glad somebody agrees. The founders of the UN Charter, by the way, as ambassador to the UN twice, I know the UN Charter reasonably well, intended it for today's great powers or tomorrow's great powers, not yesterday's great power. And the United Kingdom is yesterday's great power. It's no longer in the top league. It doesn't even have an independent foreign policy. Frankly, it's so dependent on Washington, D.C., that you can never get an independent British voice anymore. But that's just an illustration of how the world has changed. But more fundamentally, the key point I want to emphasize to all of you is that we are now witnessing structural changes in the world order. You know, we are so absorbed with headlines and Trump and this and that we don't pay enough attention to the deep underlying structural changes that are happening in the world order. And as you know, dealing with structural changes is extremely difficult. And certainly we've never before seen the kind of structural changes we're seeing today. Just to mention a few. Number one, we are seeing the end of the era of Western domination of world history. It's, you know, as I mentioned 100 years ago, Europe could run the world. Today, Europe can't run itself. I mean, that's how much the world has changed.
Well, Europe might disagree. They might say that they have, in fact, better standards of living, better social security than many parts of the world.
Well, I'm glad you
and more regional integration than most of the world.
I'm glad you used the word security, because what haunts Europe today is a deep sense of insecurity. And if you want to meet optimistic young people, don't go to Europe. Very few European young people believe that their lives will be better than that of their parents. Yes, they certainly enjoy a wonderful quality of life, but every day they wake up, they can see that they're losing a bit, right? And that's in the domestically. And so at a time when, frankly, you need very wise Western leadership to manage the transition to a new world order, and I don't have time to go into it, but if you want to understand what the new world order is going to be like, remember 3 M words, okay? The new world order will be multi-civilizational, which means we have dropped the mono-civilizational world of Western domination. You'll have many successful civilizations working with each other.
That's something the multipolar world?
No, and then number 2 is multipolar. Okay. And again, don't forget, geopolitics is different from what happens in the civilizational dimension is different from what happens in the geopolitical dimension. And that's a multipolar world. And then the third thing that's happening is that it's a multilateral world. Now, everybody thinks that multilateralism is a dying industry. Actually, if you look at our world today, most of the pressing problems that we face in our lives don't come from within our borders. They come from outside our borders, whether it's climate change, COVID, other pandemics, and so on and so forth, financial crisis. We live in a small, interdependent global village, and yet we are behaving as though our homes are separated from each other. So that's an example. But the key point I want to emphasize here is that to manage this transition to this new world order, what you really need is very dynamic, effective leadership, especially in the West, because they still represent the richest and most powerful countries, and they should basically elect wise leaders. And guess what? They elected Donald Trump. So can you imagine Donald Trump having the vision to understand how to adjust the New World Order? And in the same way, there is actually a great leadership deficit in Europe too. And I can tell you, in my last one-on-one conversation with Henry Kissinger in his office in October 2022, about a year before he died, he more or less told me that in some ways the European leaders don't understand that they have to prepare their societies for fundamental structural changes. So that's why if the world, therefore my key point to you is that if the world looks turbulent and confusing, don't be surprised, we are coping with major changes.
All right. Professor Raja Mohan, if I could ask you to maybe even respond a little bit to Professor Mahbubani's very bleak view of Western decline in a sense. Do you share that view, and where do you see this age of geopolitical conflict really taking us?
Not easy to differ with Kishore, but I mean, the Western decline has been going on for 100 years. In fact, the first books on the decline of the West were published in 1901, a man called Spengler. So I think a lot of us want to see the West decline, but I don't think it is. What is declining, there I agree with Kishore, is Europe is declining. The US still holds 26% of the global share of GDP. It is still the primary force pushing new technologies, because the Chinese have caught up. So it's really, when we say multipolar world, Asia has risen, we've risen at the expense of Europeans who have fallen, their share of the global GDP has fallen. Now, if you look at the last 5 years, the Eurozone's share as a percentage of American GDP has been declining. China has slowed down. So this notion China is going to overtake America one of these days. Now, we're not even talking about it. I don't think it'll ever happen. So I think we've got to be careful with this proposition that the West is in decline. You have to break it up. And I think that's what is more interesting. And that brings me to the fact that Trump can tell an ally, I need your territory. It tells you something, that how much the allies have become, vassals is a strong word, but I think
You're
their
referring
ability...
to Greenland and...
Yeah, the Greenland, Denmark is one of the
not
closest...
Not to mention Canada as the 51st state.
And these are proper Anglo-Saxon allies. And where Musk goes at Keir Starmer in Britain. So I think we should not, lump it together, disaggregate it. Then you'll see clearly the US is continuing to rise. China is there to challenge it. Europe is declining. Japan is declining, has been falling off for quite some time. So I think the US is going to be around. But what I want to respond to one of your initial comments, you said something very interesting. What about 100 years ago, 1925? That actually the parallels are quite eerie. Let's take three parallels. If you go back to the period between the two world wars, between 1919 to 1939, when the First World War ended and the Second World War began, one, you have the beginnings of the collapse of the old economic order. The system of free trade that existed before the First World War, that has collapsed in the interwar period, protectionism, the conflict on economics, you're having exactly that. Trump is going with a pickaxe or a Parshuram's axe to break down the WTO system, to force a rearrangement. Second, I think there was this rise of new technologies. Today we talk about AI, you mentioned it. If you go back to the interwar period, physics, the great revolution in physics, which I've done physics, the entire question of relativity, quantum mechanics, atomic energy, everything happened in that period. So you see something similar to technological revolution unfolding. And finally, there was a great power conflict, of course, that leads to the Second World War. But what is interesting today, what people are not paying enough attention, I think, is the civil war within the West. What we've seen this President Trump's election, it is a civil war within America, where one faction is saying, look, we agree with nothing of what you say. You rigged the election last time. We don't believe you won the election. And saying everything the Democrats stood for on the border, on trade, is going to change. So I think, and then similarly in Europe today, the rise of the right wing is actually challenging the old liberal hegemony. That I think is going to be far more consequential.
Dr. Taimur Baig, Professor Mahbubani spoke about 3 M's, so I'm going to ask you about the fourth, which is money. Where do you see the contestation really going today? In the past week, we have seen, for example, Mr. Trump unwork so many of these ideas. There's an America First trade policy. There's an America First foreign policy. I want to know how diplomats are going to deal with each other if their policy is an America First foreign policy. But besides that, there's the walking out from the OECD's global tax deal. There's an obvious walking away from any idea of free flow of labor, which is what so many have built their future plans on. And at the same time, we saw this, what many are calling a really unusual event overnight. The markets suddenly collapsing because it seemed like there was this new invention in China, and that would spell doom for the US. So in a sense, the kind of maybe, conversation that Professor Mahbubani and Professor Raja Mohan has started on how this is all coming down to this very simplistic rivalry between US and China. Do you see that working in the global markets as well? And do you, in a sense, then make a comparison to 100 years ago?
Right. Good evening, everybody. The comparison, in my view, should take us back 35 years before 1925. So we should start with 1890, when this gentleman called William McKinley, very powerful head of the House Ways and Means Committee, passes through the McKinley tariffs. And the reason for that was to protect the sugar industry. There was a cost of living crisis in the US, parallel to today. There was a desire to bring down some agricultural prices. So the idea was to remove tariff on dutiable sugar imports, but the sugar lobby wanted money, so let's put tariff on everything else to create that buffer. This is the time when the Americans, for the first time, started using the word billion. It was called the $1 billion Congress because it was collecting so much money through tariff that it had all sorts of pork barrel initiatives to spread around. There are some parallels between that time and the dream of Trump, which is create a barrier of tariff, protect jobs domestically, and allow domestic innovation, domestic growth to happen. Let's think through whether that is plausible under current day's parameters when we think in the context of what was happening then. At that time, although the Republicans were running the House and the Senate, the president was Grover Cleveland, a Democrat. The Democrats decided to take advantage of this polarizing move to create tariff wall by running a campaign against tariff, and by 1892 actually managed to win the House and the Senate back. But they spent the following 4 years under Cleveland with the control of the House and the Senate and the presidency to roll back the tariffs, and they failed. Because once you put up tariffs and the lobbying goes very, very strong, it is very hard to bring it down. Now, by 1896, the US was in a financial crisis. People were fed up with the Democrats. McKinley, the same guy with the McKinley tariff, now becomes a president of the United States, and 130 years later becomes the hero of Donald Trump. Trump, one of the first executive orders he passed 2 weeks ago was to change the name of Mount Denali to Mount McKinley, because he thinks what happened after McKinley became president is the blueprint for the US going forward. What happened? Despite having 50% duty on imported goods and 20% tariff on all imports, the US went through a big growth spurt in the late 1890s and early 1900s. How is that possible? Everything that I have learned in economics tells me that is impossible. If you put up a tariff wall, you will stifle competition, you will stifle innovation. What were the offsetting dynamic at play in the US at that time that made the US grow so successfully? Two things, and that's where the parallel between then and now come in. Number one, the Klondike gold rush. The US dollar was linked to gold. Huge amount of gold entered the US economy. Money supply expanded. The US went through a big monetary easing. I think the chance of the Fed cutting rates to help out Trump is pretty small, given the fact that inflation is already a problem in the US. Second, what was happening in the US in the late 1890s? Immigration. Huge number of Irish people. Italians were coming to the US. The US was going through a major expansion of its labor supply. I think we can also safely say that 2025 and 26 and 27 will not be characterized by a huge expansion of immigration in the US. Hence, the chance that we are going to get Ram Rajyata type thing in the US under a wall of tariff because McKinley pulled it off, I think is very, very unlikely. So to me, the tension that we see in the US economy right now, an economy that has been doing very well under Biden in terms of growth, going through an inflation crisis but bringing it down, massive expansion in productivity, massive gains in the stock market, is on the cusp of overheating. If Trump goes ahead with tax cuts, tariffs, immigration tightness, we will expect to see substantial problems with respect to inflation and market financial stability going forward. And to me, as much as Trump is powerful right now, and he seems immensely powerful given the developments of the last 1 week, where the world seems to be bending its knee to his will, I think the gravity of economics will bring him down.
That's an interesting point. Professor Mahbubani, the idea that that in a sense we're looking at this 1925 comparison, there's also the opposite of it. Because in the last week, what we've seen Mr. Trump do is actually completely turn around on everything we'd expected him to do. He said 60% tariffs on China from day one. He's now talking about 10%, maybe next month. He said a ban on TikTok. Now it's no ban on TikTok. He actually picked up the phone, spoke to the Chinese president and said something which you can correct me, but I don't think any American president has said in the recent past, that together US and China can resolve some of the issues of the world. Do you think the opposite of a conflict between the two is also a possibility?
Well, I think anybody who makes predictions about Donald Trump is taking a very big risk.
Based on 1 week in...
Because Donald Trump doesn't know what Donald Trump is going to do. So how can we say what he's going to do? But just to answer your question in a larger sense, I'm going to begin by first of all saying that I actually agree with some key points that both Raja made and Taimur made. I think the first key point that Raja made was that you got to make a distinction in the West between the United States and Europe, and I completely agree. You know, and when the 21st century opened, the year 2000, the European and US economies were about the same size. Today, Europe, I think, is about 2/3 of US and probably go down to half. So the United States remains an incredibly dynamic, powerful economy. You know, I visited the US 7 times last year. I was a visiting fellow in several universities. And if you go to the United States, you can feel the incredible dynamism and innovativeness of what's happening in the United States. So the United States has got to be separated from Europe. But at the same time, I think also Taimur has made a very critical point that to some extent, what all the wonderful economic growth you've seen in the last few years is also a result of massive budget deficits, right? And the US national debt, as you know, has grown dramatically. And at some point, you've got to start paying the bills, right? And this is where, I mean, so far, you mentioned the 4th M is money. I would say the 5th M is markets. And if there is one force that can discipline Donald Trump, it's the markets. Because Donald Trump associates success with, not with the GNP rise, but with the stock markets. If the stock markets are doing well, he thinks he's doing well. If the stock markets go down, he thinks he will feel bad. And just to answer your specific question on US-China relations, even on US-China relations, you mentioned that he had threatened a 65% tariff, and now he's threatening a 10% tariff. I think he's probably studied enough to know that if the US imposes a 65% tariff on China, and things really break down, then the markets will definitely go down, and then Donald Trump will be in trouble. So Donald Trump may look invincible, but he's also on a slippery slope in some areas, and which is why I agree with you, Taimur, when he was talking about the dangers of excesses in this happening. The larger point about Donald Trump I want to make is that what's strange and bizarre about this guy is that if you watch him minute by minute, he seems crazy and sort of unhinged, you know. But at the same time, I think he's not completely mad. There's a method to his madness. and he can deliver results. So, for example, Secretary of State Blinken went to the Middle East 17 times, couldn't get a single ceasefire. Donald Trump got the ceasefire done in one day. Now that's, frankly, we should be grateful that the people of Gaza have been spared this incredible daily bombardments that they were suffering. And you cannot, there's only one man who could do it. That was Donald Trump. And why? Only Donald Trump could outbully the most ruthless and most effective single politician I ever met, who's Bibi Netanyahu. It takes a Donald Trump to tell Bibi, stop. And there you can see, therefore, he's not that mad. If he wants to get something done, he can get it done. As you know, he's very proud of the fact that he delivered the Abraham Accords in his first term.
But it eventually does mean that we're talking about a world in which you bully or get bullied. There's no sort of middle ground there. Now, I'd kind of promised myself we would not only speak about Donald Trump, because there is a world out there. And Dr. Baig, if you could look into a crystal ball and give us a sense of really, I mean, there will be a world post Donald Trump in exactly 4 years. And give us a sense of how much the last 5 years of conflict, of the pandemic, the Russia invasion, the Israel bombardment, the sense of fragmentation in the world, the deep economic distress we're seeing. Let's be honest. If we're talking about a global south today, it's just because everyone is united in their sense of distress. How much of that is going to bleed into the next sort of 5 years? Where do you see it going?
Before I talk about the shocks and their impact, let me respectfully disagree with both my very eminent co-panelists on Europe. I think they're ready to sing the obituary of Europe. Let me point out a couple of things in terms of technological innovation where Europe remains at the core of the frontier. You cannot build a 2-nanometer chip in this world without ASML. That single node of excellence is unique to Europe. Nowhere else in the world it happens, and the components for ASML come from Carl Zeiss, the glass, the laser from Siemens Technologies. These are European companies. GLP-1 drugs, the key breakthrough in the last 10, 12 years in the world of medicine came from Novo Nordisk.
That's the
Americans then
Ozempics
caught up. Yeah, exactly. So there are, and of course on green transition, Europe, for all its faults, is still leading the world on regulation as well as hardware development. The Chinese have caught up, maybe going past the Europeans, but you cannot fault them for taking green transition far more seriously than the Americans have. The center of excellence in terms of labs, in terms of universities, remains still a core strength of Europe. And finally, and this is something that is at the very beginning you were alluding to, Suhasini, which is welfare. Europe has lots of problems, and fragmentation is there. They're really worried about their place in the world, and the US is pushing them around. All of that is true. But when we look at the top 20, top 30 countries in the world, in terms of life expectancy, adjusted for health, the Europeans make the list. Although not the top three. Top three are Asia, Singapore, Korea, and Japan. But the rest are Scandinavian countries and Northern European countries. So in terms of delivering welfare to their people, they're still doing a pretty good job. Oh, by the way, in that ranking, US is number 77 in the world, health-adjusted life expectancy. All right, now on shocks. We can make a laundry list of shocks, and they're all correct that we're dealing with it. But aren't we amazed by the world's shock absorption capacity? We faced a once-in-a-century pandemic. We suffered, but we've come back strong. We saw a debilitating war when Russia went into Ukraine. We thought global wheat supply and oil supply would come to a standstill, and we will have an OPEC 77, 79 type energy shock. Didn't happen. In fact, we actually have energy prices right now at a 40-year low, inflation adjusted. When we talk about the global south and the interest rate shock that we have seen in the last few years, that there will be huge amount of default and distress among poor developing economies, the multilateral system, despite all the pushback from the White House, has worked. We are seeing debt restructuring from Sri Lanka to Zambia. things are happening. So I would say the world, despite all the shocks, also has demonstrated ability to absorb the shocks. That sort of gives me some degree of assurance.
Right. Well, certainly the much-needed silver lining over there. Professor Raja Mohan, let's talk then about what this moment means for India. India seems to have very cleverly come through the conflicts by being on all sides. Or a few years ago, I wrote a piece where I said the new catchword is all alignment. And people actually took it quite seriously. And I said, no, there is no such thing. Eventually, you will be asked, which side are you? But we have navigated this part of the century through, we're in the Quad, we're in BRICS, we go to naval exercises with one part of the world, we go for counter-terror exercises with another part of the world. We, in a sense, have steered through each of these crises by saying, this is not the era of war. We just are not for war. There are, diplomacy is the way forward and that sort of thing. Then you see this future shock that we don't know when it's going to come, but it seems to be what all of you are referring to in a sense. And that is the idea that US and China will eventually make everyone choose. We have two Singaporeans here, and of course Singapore has constantly said, don't make us choose between the two. Do you see that point coming when India will need to choose, and how do you think it can either take advantage of this opportunity or deal with the challenges of it?
I think you're absolutely right. We have actually been quite good at navigating the last few years, but I think as long as you had a high growth rate, the world was willing to forgive you a lot of things. Now, I think present moment, we'll see the budget, what happens, but I think there is a certain slowdown. So I would see problems coming from that rather than the external issue. So one is can we keep up the economy going at the higher level so that you can keep catching up? Because diplomacy can only take you this far. But if your economy doesn't do, say, the whole idea was India should do 7%, 7.5, so that we can get to so-called developed status by 2047, but you're falling below 7 at 6.5, I think this would create problems rather than the global dynamic. There, I think you can manage it. Second, I think on the technological side, there is today, the US is talking about a dramatic deregulation. The Chinese have shown in the last few weeks 2 advanced fighter jet technology. Now this yesterday what they released, the DeepSeek. In a sense, the Chinese are laying out their extraordinary capabilities of technological change. But I think it's not happened overnight, the genius or something. It is a fact. Deng Xiaoping talked about scientific modernization as one of the 4 modernizations, along with economic, political, military, and scientific. But I think we are stuck there. We are not even putting 1% of our GDP on R&D. And if we think we can run our atomic energy space with acts that were passed in the 1960s. 1962 was the Atomic Energy Act. That we have not changed anything. I think there is such a resistance to reorganization. While Trump is saying, look, we're going to root and branch overall, and what China has done is something similar. So I think we've not really fully paid attention, though we're kind of skimming off some of the digital side. But I think if you don't move in a big way on the technological modernization, that gap between us and the US and China, on the other hand, will continue to really grow, and that will again pose problems.
All right. In your estimation then, as the last 4 years where, we were in this kind of no relationship with China, trade went to record highs, but actually we were stopping, and we were stopping visas, where do you think that policy has led then?
No, I think China, I think there is, as you said, there is a bit of easing. Okay, you'll have direct flights, you'll have visas, you'll have the, Manasaro Yatra. But I think you still have 50,000 troops facing each other.
That's right.
You have a $100 billion trade deficit. You have, they're building a big dam on Brahmaputra. So I think those big issues are not even being addressed. So what we're doing is, look, 5 years of not doing anything, at least there is a military disengagement as opposed to de-escalation. They've kind of separated a bit. So that has given us a small opening, but the big issues with China remain. So I would say it again takes you back to the US. The US is still the player for us. $200 billion of trade, if you include services and manufacturers. So what we do with the US, that's why you started by saying Modi's visit. So if we can keep moving that relationship forward so that that boosts your economic growth, your technological growth, that I think is the key. But the problem, as we said, Trump is a different commodity. How we deal with him, I think that's going to be a big test for us in the coming next few weeks.
Okay, I want to go around to all of you with one last question before I try to get some questions in from the audience. And maybe I can start with you, Professor Raja Mohan. Is the challenge of technology and what it is going to mean for migration? You wrote this piece where you've actually said something people had not articulated for a while, where you said India has to move on from this H-1B conversation, this constant push that our best and brightest should somehow be admitted into Western countries, and and that the US should not in any way restrict them. Even so, what we are seeing is the possibility. I mean, if I were just on one hand to count, returns are going to increase, deportations are going to increase. Maybe they will be blue-collar workers, but India is going to have to find ways to provide for them when they return. H-1Bs and professional temporary visa holders in the US are increasingly being told, your children don't really have a future here. They won't get citizenship by birthright, even if that's challenged in court. These are mid-level. And then they are consistently also seeing the advent of technology and what I call the AI apocalypse. But the idea, you hear, I think it was Mark Zuckerberg, who said that by the end of 2025, he expects to see mid-level engineers go away. They'll be replaced by the machine. Sundar Pichai of Google, I think, has said that 25% of all code is now being written by AI, is already being written by AI. All of this is going to put a lot of pressure on a country that does have, our biggest resource is our people, in a sense. We have fought for trade policies. We walked out of RCEP for other reasons as well. But essentially because we said you have to recognize that India's services are important and that you must take Indians to carry out these services. Services of 55%, I think, of our GDP. So the question really, when it comes to technology, when it comes to these anti-immigrationary forces, I'm not even going into the politics of the demagogues, the xenophobia, the anti-immigrant sentiment that has been on the rise for at least the past decade around the world. How is India going to cope with this?
Look, I think we've had a great time for the last 50 years. The doors of the Western societies were open for immigration, and the Indians were well placed to take advantage. So most of our migration has gone to the English-speaking world. It's because of the connection. Again, some things of empire still give us some advantage. That is really the big advantage of the English-speaking countries. But I think that phase is over. Today, immigration is a toxic issue in all the Western societies, Europe, US. So I think there is a pushback against that. So I think we have to be prepared to, at least on the illegal side, to take them back. Second, I think on the professional migration, my sense is the reason why they took them was it was a business logic. So against the labor activist logic, look, importing labor decreases wages, so therefore it's not good. That tension is an internal argument. We can't do anything about it. But my sense is the demand for Indian STEM talent will continue for some more time. Remember, we traveled to Germany. Germany has taken almost 20,000 Indians into tech professionals. So some movement will take place. But I think we should focus on, not on body shopping, which our companies do, but say, how do we use our talent for the growth of our own economy? Can we do more here? Make it easier for Western capital to come and invest, or even Chinese capital to invest in India and build on the existing capabilities rather than simply shipping people out. The question is, how do we create domestic talent? And I think, as you said, the focus in the end would be, are we ready to deal with the AI revolution? And I think it's going to sweep across from even the small things we do, whether you're a journalist or a teacher, a writer. The amount of things that what it can do today is phenomenal. This is just the generative AI. We're not talking about robotics. We're not talking about the other applications. So I think there's going to be a profound period of revolutionary change in the way economic production is going to be organized. But I think we're not, while a Prime Minister talks about technology, there's a lot of support to technology, but I think the systems, the bureaucratic system, the administrative structures, I don't think we're ready mentally or organizationally to cope with that. And I think that's really the challenge for us.
Dr. Baig, weigh in on how this is, you come to India quite often. So is India prepared for this next world really where our services are not going to come with a welcome mat? They're not going to give us a welcome mat around the world. And the idea that, in a sense, trade policies, RCEP, the regional comprehensive economic partnership that India walked out of, over the idea that services must be included. Do you think that entire way of thinking has to change? And how prepared do you think India is? And I know I'm conflating two separate issues here, but I'm trying to talk about the basic issue, which is how do you deal with your biggest resource of people? India is the world's biggest population. Is India prepared for the advent of this AI-driven world?
I don't think anybody's prepared, but I see promising examples in India. If you talk to Foxconn executives who are involved with the Apple supply chain being built in India and the assembly, you will be impressed. I'm surprised that this hasn't really made it to the public domain, but the yield in the Apple plant in India is almost as good as the ones in China. This was something nobody expected. Everybody thought that Apple would actually struggle because iPhone assembly is immensely complex. It is not just putting a few things together. There's a huge amount of testing, packaging, assembly involved, requires substantial local know-how. My understanding from Apple, they're super impressed with the yield in India. I see MG cars all over the roads in India these days. JSW, SAIC 50-50 partnership. This is what China has done over the decades. India is now pushing. You want to build in India, tap into the local market, do a joint venture with an Indian industrial conglomerate. And I think
just don't try to leave, as Ford and GM found out.
Right.
Because the exit policies are difficult.
Exactly. So I think that these two examples tell you that the modern manufacturing is not something that is elusive. It can be done in India. We are seeing two of the cutting-edge industrial products being made in India, and both of these required India to remain open with China. Tim Cook, before he signed the deal to build in India, had to get significant concession from Delhi to make sure that the OEMs coming from China were tariff-free. Otherwise, this would not make sense. Similarly, I think Indians tend to think MG is a British car, but by the way, all the components are in China. So I see on the manufacturing-led growth side a strategic rethink. I welcome that. My bank in Singapore, we had over the years a lot of Chinese nationals who couldn't get visa to India to come and do projects in DBS India. Guess what, in 2024, everybody got their visas. We have spoken with engineers or company executives in Oppo, in Xiaomi in the past, non-stop complaint. How do we expand our plant in India if our engineers don't get visa? 2024, everybody got the visas. So I agree with Professor Raja Mohan that India needs to sort of seize the opportunities that geopolitics presents to itself. There is a China plus one narrative. India should take full advantage of that. But let's also not forget, the biggest devotee to the China plus one narrative right now are the Chinese themselves. They want to take uncompetitive businesses out of China. They want to avoid sanctions coming from the West. And India, if it sort of seizes on that opportunity through joint venture, through tech transfer, could stand to benefit tremendously because China is on a weak footing on that. They would love to have some degree of cooperation from India on that.
Can take some of that load. Professor Mahbubani, last word to you. I've tried to conflate, slightly unsuccessfully, the problems of trade, migration, and technology. But do you see, broaden the debate for us, do you see in this US-China contestation, who's going to win?
Well, just quickly before I answer your question, because there's a third key player in this, as you know, and Taimur mentioned it, Europe. The world will be better off if there's a stronger Europe. But I'll give you 3 examples. One, he mentioned ASML. I met a senior executive of ASML who told me ASML went capital to capital in Europe saying, hey, We in Europe must decide the future of ASML. We must decide to whom we sell our machines to. We must develop our own R&D. We must be an independent, autonomous European actor. Guess what? You know who decided the future of ASML? Washington, D.C. decided, not Europe. Okay? As big a continent as Europe is, Washington, D.C. decided. And then you number two, and this is a huge disaster. I can understand why the neocons of the United States wanted a war with Russia, because it weakens Russia. Why should Europe want a war with Russia? Why does Europe want to increase its dependence on the United States by getting involved in a war with Russia? United States can withdraw across the Atlantic Ocean, which Donald Trump threatens to do. Europe's got to live with Russia for the next 1,000 years. The stupidest thing to do was to provoke a war in Ukraine. Now, certainly the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal, but the amount of provocations that were made towards Russia could have been avoided if there had been wiser European leadership. And this is also another point that Kissinger made to me. And I make these points because if you want examples of how to adapt to this new world, there are positive examples and there are negative examples, and Europe is a negative example of how you adapt to this world, which is why you get this sense of pessimism in Europe. And Europe had a tremendous opportunity to play a role of a third independent pole in the US-China contest. Then that would have increased their leverage. But they have effectively given up their leverage and have become completely dependent on the US, and now US writes European policy towards China in many areas. And that would say is a negative example. The positive point, therefore, because, you know, and you know, we're all talking about AI. The continent, you know, which got great universities like Europe, has the third biggest economy in the world. Where does it stand on AI? Zero. I mean, not 10%, not 5%, zero on AI, right? But that's where the real contest is going to be. And for all of us outside US and China, the wisest thing we can do is to not get involved on one side or the other. Because nobody can tell you 10 to 20 years who will be stronger. Will it be the US? Will it be China? The US has got amazing strengths. China has got amazing strengths. US has got structural weaknesses. China has got structural weaknesses. So this contest will be absolutely amazing. It's probably the biggest geopolitical contest ever that we have seen since human history began. You've never seen powers of the size and scale of US and China tangling with each other. So don't assume that either of them will win or either of them will lose. You got to figure out how you take advantage of this contest to enhance your own national interests. And when it comes to geopolitics, the biggest mistake countries make is to become emotional. Geopolitics is a very cruel business. You know, United States will use you. We can be a great friend like Denmark. Yeah. Who cares? Give me Greenland, right? Look at Canada. No country could have been nicer to the United States than Canada. Look at Canada being slapped right, left and right in the face every day, right? So the lesson, therefore,
you'll find that a lot of people in India are not unhappy about that right now.
Work out what your own interests are, calmly, dispassionately, focus on your own interests and where you can advance your interests by working with the United States, work with the United States, and where you can advance your interests by working with China, work with China, and never get emotional.
All right.